Hello, church family. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for watching. We're going to wrap up this series that we have been doing on the Restoration Plea and looking at the Restoration movement here in America. We've been looking at a lot of great work that people have done, looking at a lot of great lessons that they have taught, and taking a look for over a couple of weeks for the work of Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone. But as we know, there are many more individuals that are to be credited with the Restoration Plea here in the States, aside from those men. They did great work, but there are some great men that we owe a debt of gratitude in the work that they were able to do, things that they were able to accomplish, the influence and the impact that they had on so many people, getting them out of denominationalism and getting them back into the Bible, back into the New Testament, and looking at Bible authority and what the New Testament has to say. And so we're going to look at some of these early preachers here in America for this lesson, look at some of their accomplishments, the things that they were able to do, looking at their work, and just how instrumental they were in the efforts here in the States. It was Paul who writes this letter to Timothy so long ago, and he tells Timothy, "The things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also." That is, when you look at the preachers of the Restoration movement, they are the product going all the way back to the words that Paul was telling Timothy. He was telling this young preacher, I want you to take what I have taught you. And in other words, Paul is saying, everything that I have written, everything that I have given you, the knowledge I have given you, and certainly that was by inspiration. He says, I want you to take this and you teach other people the same thing so they can teach other ones. And here we are, 2020 today, and we're still going by the very same fundamental idea of taking everything that we see in the Bible and preaching it to other people so they can do the same thing. And certainly the preachers of the Restoration movement here in America did just that, and it was why they were so effective. We owe so much today. Preachers today would not be able to do the work that we are doing, and certainly not have the impact that we are hopefully making without the work of those preachers early in America, many of them who came over, many of them who were reared here in America, but doing the work that they were, going all the way back to the words of Paul, teaching people so that they could teach others, and so on. And we certainly see the product of all of that. But I want to take a look at some of these key figures, and certainly we're not going to have the time to cover all of them. And so as we go through this lesson, I want to take a look at some of these key individuals and then look at some resources. I want to share with you some resources. These are the tools that I use in a lot of my studies. When I have to reference something, when I write when I have to write a paper on something, these are the tools, the resources that I'm able to cite, and I want to be able to share them with you. They are invaluable in looking at the history of the Restoration movement here in America and looking at the work of so many great men. The first one I want to take a look at today, though, is a man named Raccoon John Smith. This is a nickname that was given to him, he's probably one of the most colorful characters to come out of the Restoration movement in that day. He came out of the Baptist religion, and so he was converted, understanding and realizing that everything that he had been taught was not what he thought it was, and he looked at New Testament doctrine and realized his error, and he had an open mind and an open heart, a sincere heart enough to leave that and get back to New Testament teaching, and eventually he became a preacher himself. But people really didn't expect a lot of him. He was not looked at as a real educated man, and it was because of his background. This was a man who was from the backwoods. He lived in Kentucky, raised in Kentucky. He only had about 4 months of formal education behind him. He liked to quote a lot of philosophers, and so when he would speak or when he would write, people did not expect a whole lot of him. But he's probably one of the most quotable preachers in that day. He had a sense of humor about him that really kind of shone through, and I want to share some of those with him. He was outspoken when it came to preaching the gospel and his interaction with different people. And so I want to share a couple of different accounts so you're really going to get to know the kind of person that Raccoon John Smith was. And I want to make sure that I get these right. These are accounts that other people have told regarding his life. There was one who said that after he had shown the absurdities of the mourner's bench, he was preaching about the mourner's bench one day. But he was preaching. He had shown the absurdities of the mourner's bench theory of getting religion. He was asked at that time, "Well, what is the difference between your baptism for the remission of sins and our mourner's bench?" He looked at the individual and he said, "Well, one is from heaven and the other is from the sawmill." And that is the kind of humor that he would display in this. There was another time when he baptized several members of a certain family, and he was very close to the family, very close to the father. But after he baptized his entire family, he meets the father of the family, or he talks to him, and he'd always been a close friend of the man, and he's quoted as saying, he greets him saying, "Good morning, my brother," said Smith to him kindly. But the old man fixed a scornful look upon him and said, "Don't call me brother, sir. I would rather claim kin with the devil himself." Well, Smith looks at him and he says, "Okay, go then, sir, and honor your father." So we see the kind of, just the kind of individual that he could be. He was really quick with his comebacks. There was one account, is probably one of my favorite accounts. I want to read it and get this right. Smith was watching a Methodist preacher baptize an infant baby. And this is found in a book. I'm going to actually be referencing this later, called The Return to the Old Paths. But it says there's an incident when Smith tried to baptize a Methodist preacher. Smith was conducting a meeting at Slate Creek, Kentucky. Methodist preacher was in a meeting across town. Smith attended a service by the side of the creek when the Methodist preacher sprinkled water on a screaming infant and called it baptism. When Raccoon had a baptism in the same creek the next day, the Methodist preacher was standing nearby on the bank. After the baptismal ceremony, Smith got out of the water and approached the Methodist preacher and began to pull him toward the creek. The Methodist demanded to know what he was doing. He says, "I'm going to baptize you, sir," replied Smith. "But I do not wish to be baptized." Smith asked him, "Well, do you not believe?" "Well, certainly I do," the Methodist stated. And then, "Well, then come along, sir. Believers must be baptized, but I'm not willing to go. It certainly would do me no good to be baptized against my will." John Smith then stated, "Did you not but yesterday baptize a helpless babe against its will? Did you get its consent first, sir? Come along with me, for you must be baptized." But the man protested, and Smith released him. Smith then told the preacher to go his way, and he told the audience on the creek bank, "Let me know if he ever again baptizes others without their full consent, for you yourselves have heard him declare that such a baptism cannot do any good." What a character, but certainly what great work he was doing for making sure people understood the truth of the New Testament. He really had an ability to reason and to simplify things to get them to understand. Smith would end up dying on February the 29th of 1868, and he was buried in the Lexington Cemetery. We had a chance to actually visit that cemetery and see his gravesite. So we certainly owe so much to men like Raccoon John Smith. There was another individual that was very instrumental in that day named John T. Johnson. Johnson was a Kentucky preacher born in 1788, and he was known to be a quiet man. He was able to, he had the ability, he was known to make his sermons very personal. He was conversational in his teaching, and but he was also at the same time very active in getting things established and making sure that things got off the ground. In fact, he was one of the ones who helped establish Bacone College. And Bacone College, we mentioned last lesson, being set up by Francis Bacon, but John T. Johnson was very active in helping him get that off the ground. Pendleton actually compared Johnson once to the Apostle Paul in the way that he would preach and the way that he would interact with other individuals. He came from a political family. His brother was the 9th Vice President of the United States. And a lot of these men were tied to the politics in that day and were able to correspond sometimes with people high up in politics. Sadly, he died of pneumonia on December the 18th, 1856 at only 68 years old. But he led a really interesting life and did a lot for the cause of the Restoration movement that was here in America. Another individual was a man named Walter Scott. Scott was kind of the opposite of Raccoon John Smith. He was actually known to be more moody, and it was possible that he was a manic depressive, and just in the way that he would conduct things and the way that he would interact with different people. What is interesting to know, though, and some of us have probably seen this, and it may have actually helped us understand it ourselves or help to explain it to other people with the plan of salvation. It was Walter Scott who came up with the 5-finger exercise for the plan of salvation. And you may have heard people talk about this before, but it's the 5-finger exercise. We have hear, believe, repent, confess, and then you go down into the waters of baptism and up a new creature. And so it was, if you've heard that in the past, that was Walter Scott who actually came up with that plan to easily identify and easily easily explain the steps of salvation with him. And so we're certainly grateful for Walter Scott and the work that he did. He was born in Scotland. His father was a music teacher. His mother actually wanted him to be a minister in the Scottish Presbyterian Church, but he would ultimately leave that and look at New Testament teaching, and was very influenced himself. He was very affected by that teaching. He went on to write 2 different papers, one called The Evangelist and the other one called The Protestant Unionist. He also wrote a publication called The Gospel Restored. He wrote one called The Messiahship or Great Demonstration, but he was most remembered for his work on the Western Reserve and the Golden Oracle. And so Walter Scott had a lot of material that was available to different people, and certainly it helped them in understanding it as well, just as he ended up understanding it himself. Another individual that we can look at is a man named Tolbert Fanning. Fanning he would start one of the most popular papers in our history. He helped establish Franklin College. And Franklin College was interesting because David Lipscomb, who you I'm sure have heard, and David Lipscomb was very instrumental in with restoration and so forth. But David Lipscomb, T.B. Larimore, we're going to be looking at T.B. Larimore in just a minute, and a man named Elisha Sewell, all received their training from Franklin College. He was known for a couple of different papers, one called the Christian Review, but another paper that you've probably heard of called the Gospel Advocate, and he started that in 1855, and he edited that with the help of David Lipscomb. And so the Gospel Advocate, which is still around today, has gone through a lot of different editors, but still doing great work even to this day. Well, that was started in 1855 by Tolbert Fanning. He is known to be a religious historian, did a lot of great work, and if you ever get a chance to read some of his material, it's well worth your time to do so. He never supported the Missionary Society, and that was one really interesting thing. Remember, it was Campbell that kind of started that, and some of these preachers were involved with it, and then they left it. But Fanning was never one to even support that. He would not come out publicly with it, and the reason for that is because a lot of his friends did support it. He was friends with Campbell. He was friends with Ben Franklin. We're going to look at his life in just a moment. But Fanning never wavered, but he would always kind of keep it, he would always keep it kind of silent, or wasn't real vocal about it because of the men that he was, with which he was colleagues. And so Fanning did a lot of great work and started one of the major publications that we're able to enjoy even today. There was another man that was very active in that, and he had an interesting life. His name was Philip Slater Fall. Philip preached mostly in Kentucky. He did some of his preaching in Nashville, and he was born in England. And so, he's born in a town called Culloden, England. I'm probably butchered the pronunciation of that, but he came to the United States at the age of 19. He lived in Pittsburgh, and then he moved from Pittsburgh to Kentucky. He starts a school in 1818 in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, he was licensed to preach in the Baptist church at 21 years old. He marries a woman named Annie, and he hears about Campbell after one of his debates, and so he becomes very curious about the work of Campbell, and it was through that he would end up being converted out of the Baptist church. 1822, Fall reads Campbell's Sermon on the Law at Brush Run, and mentioned Brush Run Church last session as well. That was a congregation that Campbell was very closely related to and did a lot of work with them. But Fall reads a lot of his work. He hears his debate and ends up being converted. He was known, in fact, he was known as the very first, this is his kind of this claim to fame, he was known as the first Baptist preacher in the state of Kentucky who would ultimately accept the ancient order of things, who went back to New Testament teaching and left the Baptist church. And so his life is very interesting when you look at the history of people being restored. Some of these, many of these preachers came out of that themselves, and they ended up doing a lot of great work. It reminds me a lot of Paul, coming out of where he did, and started defending the very truth that they probably many times criticized in the past. Another one is Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, not the one who discovered electricity, but Benjamin Franklin born in 1812, started his work at the time of Campbell's Millennial Harbinger. And of course, Millennial Harbinger was a very effective tool that Campbell wrote about, and a lot of great information in the Millennial Harbinger, and I have some of that in my digital files here. But Ben Franklin started his work right around that same time. He'd been preaching for about 10 years, but he was really not too well known at that time. In 1845, he begins to be influenced in the American movement, and at 33 years old, he finally starts to become really well known and establishes himself as being one of the kind of the premier preachers in that day. He started several different papers and was very closely associated with several of them. One was called The Reformer. One was called The Western Reformer. There was another one called The Proclamation and Reformer. There was another paper called The Christian Age, and another one called American Christian Review. And so he was very active in writing and getting these papers out and making sure that they got into the hands of those who certainly needed to hear them. And so we're grateful for that kind of work that he did. He died in 1878 in his chair while working. And so, imagine just he working right up until the point of literally not being able to do it anymore. One of the other men that we're looking at that was very instrumental and really very pivotal at a very pivotal point, put out so much great work, and that was the work of T.B. Larimore. T.B. Larimore, he writes something called The Life, Letters, and Sermons, and it is put out by his wife, actually. His most famous sermon that he was known for was one called The Glorious Gospel of Christ. He started the School of Mars Hill in Florence, Alabama. After a short period of time, he closes the school because he said it was starting to interfere with all of his work. Now, it would eventually open up back up, but he did close it for some time because he wanted to devote his time to the work and preaching and trying to get people back on track. And so he saw that as kind of a hindrance to his work, closes it for a short period, and opens it back up. Earl West, who wrote a book on the Restoration Movement as well, knew Mrs. Larimore in her later years, his wife. And so Larimore, though, was also, he was known to be kind of a harsh preacher. In fact, his doctor thought that he was very critical. His doctor didn't want to accept the gospel, and Larimore would call him on it ultimately. But we need to remember sometimes that even though we really want to preach the truth in love, and we certainly want to exercise that love of Christ when we do preach, there are times when we do need to stand up and we need to be stern. Remember, Paul told Timothy, 2 Timothy 4:2, preach the word, and to be instant in season and out of season. But then he tells him, reprove, which is to correct, rebuke, and exhort. Notice there's kind of two negatives there and one positive. He says you need to correct people, but you also need to rebuke them at times, but encourage them as well. And Larimore was known to really, he did not pull any punches. He really wanted to make sure people would understand the truth, and he was known to, really correct and rebuke people at times. He idolized his mother, loved his mother so much. In fact, her body was buried in Scrantonville, Tennessee. His father was unknown in that time, and no one really knew what happened to his father. B.C. Goodpasture, who was another preacher in that day who was very active, thought that his father might have been President Andrew Johnson. There was another rumor that was going around that Andrew Jackson was his father, but he was actually dead by this time. T.B. Larimore actually did the wedding for his daughter, Molly and R.P. Meeks, and Meeks would actually go on to teach at Freed-Hardeman College. He was known, even though he had his harsh preaching, some people accused him of being critical. He was actually known to be very courteous and very kind. And some people even criticized him because of this. They thought that he wouldn't take a stand, but when you listen to his preaching and read some of his work, you're able to see otherwise. G.C. Brewer wrote a lot about Larimore. In fact, he wanted Larimore to baptize him, but it would ultimately be McGarvey who would baptize G.C. Brewer. Larimore's brother was involved in the Civil War, and he actually died in the Civil War. They never found the body. On January 3rd of 1894, he started a meeting that would actually last until June. And through this meeting, with this meeting, he preached 333 sermons with an average of 50 minutes with every single one of them. You think, wow, that's a long time to be preaching. But when you consider the fruits of his labor during that meeting, there were 261 baptisms that came out of that gospel meeting. Folks, the gospel works. When you preach New Testament and you get people to understand the simplicity of it, and you can get people back understanding, the meaning and the fruits of what the New Testament is, there are going to be results. That is how we're going to make Christians. When he preached those sermons, he got back to New Testament thinking, he got into the Bible and got other people into the Bible, and that is how he was able to baptize 261 people. He died sadly in 1900. He was 1900. He was 55 years old. He would actually come to California with and do a lot of his work here. And in fact, he meets his wife, Emma, who was born in Santa Ana, California. He meets this California girl. And at 85 years old, he holds this meeting in California. He fell and broke his hip during this meeting, and he was put in the hospital. Well, people, he became so popular at that time, people flooded his hospital room. And that one of the people who would end up visiting him in the hospital was a man named Foy E. Wallace. And Foy E. Wallace did a lot of work, and he has some commentaries out. In fact, I have a few of them, I believe, in my library, and you may have as well. But Foy Wallace did a great work as well, but he was one of the visitors that would visit him in the hospital. Larimore told Wallace that if the Lord's ready, then I'm ready to go. And he died in that same hospital room here in California in 1930. It was interesting during one part of his life when he was here in California, when he was in Berkeley. Brethren wanted a new building, but he had no money at all. And he was trying to get the work out and helping different people. But so sadly he didn't have enough money, or that he claimed to have enough money. A little boy sent him $1 to help out Larimore. What encouragement that we get from children, and just the selfless and the benevolent heart that children have. But we are certainly grateful for the life that he led, and certainly so effective in how he reached different people. John William McGarvey, many of us know him as J.W. McGarvey, is probably one of the most famous and most instrumental people that are involved with the Restoration movement. He put out a lot of work, well known by his writings and certainly by his life and the people that he would, his colleagues, the people that he would associate himself with. He wrote a publication called The Christian Evidences. He was actually among the first graduates of Bethany College. I mentioned this last time, but I want to mention it again. He was among the first graduates of Bethany College. Remember, that's the college that was, Alexander Campbell was closely associated with, and he gave his graduation speech in Latin. So he was very smart, very intelligent, especially with other languages. He wrote, several commentaries. One commentary that he wrote was called The Fourfold Gospel, and if you do not have that, make sure you have that in your library. It is well worth having the Fourfold Gospel, and it's him looking at the four gospel accounts. The life of Christ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He wrote another commentary on Acts, and that is well worth having as well. He also wrote a book that was very interesting called Lands of the Bible. He actually visited a lot of the places over in the Bible lands, and he wrote a journal of sorts. I've referenced that many times, and looking at these different places and what he wrote about the culture that was over there, things that he saw at that time, and looking at how these things had developed over the years from the time that they were very prominent in the pages of the Bible, and just how they had changed a little bit over the years. But he wrote a lot about the culture and the customs of the lands of the Bible. It's interesting. He opposed war. Some of these individuals got very vocal and outspoken about certain political things, about war and so forth. David Lipscomb, for instance, never believed that a Christian should vote. J.W. McGarvey never believed that war should ever be the answer. Of course, we don't like war, but he really was very vocal about it. One of the things that was very interesting, though, he would never shy away from preaching to people. He cared so much about souls, and on one account, he preached to a group of black brethren, and he was a lot of people were opposed by this, but McGarvey cared about people, and so he would, there was no audience that would be left unattended by him as far as he was concerned. He was very vigilant in preaching against instrumental music, and a lot of these preachers were, because again, coming out of denominationalism, and with denominationalism being so visible and so popular at that time, that of course that's what made them have the error that they did. And a lot of this was worship. And so McGarvey did a lot of writing and a lot of preaching against instrumental music, and a lot of was very vocal with standing opposed to what that would be, and how that was influencing different people. And finally, who could ever, forget the great work of Marshall Keeble? This was a man that so many of us, we owe so much to the work of Marshall Keeble, and he has influenced so many of us. And whenever we talk about the Restoration movement, his name always comes up for the great work that he did. Keeble, he preached in a time when segregation was probably at one of its highest points, and racism in the country was just widespread, and Keeble never lost his temper with it. In fact, he approached everything with such humility and such a love for God and such a love for souls. And I want to share just some of the accomplishments. I think his accomplishments really speak for themselves, and that is what really kind of elevates him to to being one of the most impactful preachers of any time. Looking over the last number of years, looking at the what New Testament teaching can do, and looking at what we can do when we can hold our tongue at times and know when to respond and know when when to talk and when not to. Keeble is such a great example of this, but just it's amazing the work that he did And it's such a great encouragement to so many preachers and hopefully to so many members when you study the life of Marshall Keeble. I want to look at some of the different things that he did over the years, though. In 1923, Keeble that year conducted 18 different gospel meetings, baptizing 208 people during that year. That's an amazing figure right there. But that, I mean, you haven't seen anything yet. He restored 59 people that year. He began 2 congregations of that same year. I mean, think of how active he was. We get pretty excited when we have some baptisms over the year, but you think he was, 18 different meetings, over 200 baptisms, starting 2 congregations, watching 59 people being able to be restored. What a great encouragement that is to know that kind of work was being done, and it still can be done today. In 1926, here's an amazing account right here. 1926, he's speaking in Summit, Georgia, amidst the Ku Klux Klan being as active as they can be right there. In the midst of all of this, he had 3 baptisms come from it. Can you imagine Marshall Keeble preaching in the middle of all of this racism and hatred and violence, and baptizing 3 people out of the KKK? What an amazing work he did. In 1930, he preached 396 sermons over 46 weeks, held 15 meetings, and baptized 420 people that year. 19 of those individuals were preachers. And so he did a great work. In fact, he was known at one time to, there's an account of how he goes into this Baptist church. He got to know the Baptist preacher, goes into this church, converts the preacher, and in turn, what it did is help convert this entire congregation of Baptist members. He was very active in what he did. In 1936, he baptized 15,000 people. Amid all of the hostile racial tensions, everything that he saw, what a life he lived at such an interesting part of our history. He remained calm, he remained humble, and he remained faithful. And in turn, he ended up baptizing over 40,000 people in his life. That's remarkable. But it is all because of a love for New Testament Christianity and a love for souls. Folks, we can reach people the same way. We may not have the same number. We're not trying for the same number, but we want to try for as many people as we possibly can. But imagine being able to reach people in probably some of the most unorthodox settings, certainly the most unique environments. But we can reach people. When we go to the Bible and teach Bible and the Bible only, it's going to change lives. You think about, preachers of the Restoration Movement fought to restore worship of New Testament church. They fought to, get back to New Testament teaching and looking at what they were able to do with worship and getting people back. In fact, it was Campbell who said of instrumental music, it's like a cowbell at a concert. When we look at all the work of these men, not just these men we looked at today, but of all of them who worked so diligently because they cared about people getting back to New Testament thinking. They wanted to see people get to heaven. If someone wrote our history based on this century, could it be said of us that we cared preserving the gospel, the same way? It's something to think about. Our roots, remember, all of these things, that as great as it was though, our roots are not in a restoration movement. I cannot stress that enough. We've been doing this series on the restoration movement here in America and how great it was and how impactful it was, but make no mistake, our roots are not in New Testament, or not in restoration movement. They are in the New Testament doctrine. They are in New Testament thinking. We stand on the shoulders of these giants. Those giants could not be where they were if it was not for the Christ. We stand on the greatest shoulders of all when we go back to his teaching and follow him. The future is contingent on getting back to Bible authority. The standard of which we are to live, it changes the direction of our thinking. There's several times in Scripture that we're able to see how we are to be doers of the Word. And this term, the Word, keeps coming up as we read through the New Testament. It is the standard by which we have to live. James 1, verse 22, James says, "Be ye doers of the Word." There was a lot of doers, and there's been a lot of doers in the religious world, but are they doers of the Word, of God's Word? That implies that the Word is already there, it has been established, and we need to make sure that we get back to doing what is being asked of us and what it is instructing us to do. We cannot improve God's message. And any attempt to try to do it robs God of his authority. That's what we need to do, is get people back working with the same cause, the same purpose that these preachers of the New Testament doctrine, and trying to get people back into it in early stages of America, we're trying to do. Paul said, preach, to Timothy, preach the Word. And there it is again. It implies that the Word is already here. It's not my word. It's not your word. We need to preach the words of the New Testament, the words that have been taught to so many people from the apostles and these great inspired writers. The church in the first century thrived because of that. They were what God intended them to be. 3,000 Jews on the day of Pentecost thrived because they left Judaism and they were converted through repenting and being baptized and having their sins washed away, being added to the church. This body of New Testament people who were called out of Christ, the ones who stood for Christ, they were exactly what God had intended them to be. And they ended up following a simple faith system, as we see in Ephesians chapter 4, that there was one Lord, one faith, one baptism for every person. And that was necessary among all the paganism to understand what that one faith system was. There is freedom from sin in the Bible. We're able to see it. You look at Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, and it comes up again. Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the Word. And so we have this Word, and it's the same Word that those on Pentecost heard. It's the same Word that everyone in the New Testament could understand, that we are to repent, and we are to confess, and we are to be baptized, and that is how we make disciples. And then we continue, as they did in Acts chapter 2, we continue in the apostles' doctrine. You notice all those people who were in the first century scattered because they were persecuted. They didn't pray for it to end. They prayed to get through it. And that's exactly what God's going to help us do in this day and age as well. He's going to help us get through it. That's what they were working for here in America, to get people to understand, working through certain things. Planting the seeds in the hearts of men is what is going to change the lives of this nation. They planted those seeds in the first century. They planted those seeds in early America, and they watered it. There were preachers that were so instrumental, and that is what we can do today. Plant that seed while others water it, and let the Lord have the increase. How grateful we are for the work of these men. How grateful we are that we have the same gospel they had in early America, which was the same gospel that they had in the first century. And we can do the same kind of work and see the same kind of results. Hopefully this has been beneficial. I do want to make mention of these resources, as I said. The first one is a book that is I have used on a lot of different occasions. And if you don't have these, you can find them from different Brotherhood publications. I would be happy to steer you in the right direction. But the first one is called Return to the Old Paths. It's written by Glenn McCoy, and Glenn does a great work with this book. And this is I've got this in my collection, and I've used it so many times, and so grateful for the great work that Glenn McCoy has done with this book. It's a history of the Restoration movement, covering a lot of the different preachers, some that we haven't covered as well. Another book that is very great, it's actually a series of books, 4-part volume called The Search for the Ancient Order. This is volume 1. It covers from 1800 to 1865. There's 4 parts. I have all 4 volumes in my library. I'd be happy to lend that out. Written by Earl Irvin West. And then there's the website, therestorationmovement.com. I've got, again, a lot of great information from this website, and this is a great stockpile of information. There's a lot of great, the preachers, just so many different preachers that you would never even think of that were so involved in the movement for restoration here in America. You can find on this website a lot of photos, it lists a lot of their accomplishments in chronological order, and and they keep adding to it. They do a great work with with the Restoration Movement website. And finally, this is a lectureship book. It's from the Memphis School of Preaching back in 2015. It was all on the Restoration, some great manuscripts. You can also probably find the audio of all of these preachers that did it, but there were a lot of great men who spent a lot of time putting these lessons together and making it available for those who would like to pursue the studies. And so there's a lot of great resources that are out there that really add to everything that we have been teaching. We're certainly grateful for all the great work, but if you get a chance, don't just stop here. I did not have all the time to cover so many different great preachers that did so many great works and really changed the hearts of America by getting them out of these different religions, getting them back to New Testament thinking and looking at the one true church that we find in the pages of Scripture. But again, we are glad that you have been following this if you have, and certainly we are praying for you. If you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to let me know. You can probably comment below. And please let me know also just how it is. We're always looking for feedback, but if you would like any further information, please do not hesitate to ask. We will conclude this with this series on the restoration, and we look forward to seeing you again and look forward to having everyone back together.